Woohoo. Oh, that's neat. I don't think I ever got the prompt to leave before. I think I've just been told that Big Brother is watching you, and then made to sit here and have to manually escape if I need to. Okay. Hello, everyone. We're focused today on chapters 5 and 6 of Knowledge Architecture, which are knowledge architecture segments and knowledge object modeling. The chapters are about as sexy as they sound. In my reading of them, I'm still searching for pragmatics. I'm still searching for usability. As we've talked about in several of the previous meetings, the book is like fairly high level and abstract and sort of bringing a bunch of things together, but not necessarily landing them in a unique place yet, at least in my view. But we're getting there, and I think these chapters started to get there more than the last 4 by far. So hopefully it's representative of a trend, and we'll keep seeing the content of the book get closer and closer to like usability and less sort of theoretical talk about the shape of knowledge or whatever it is Bedford's getting at. So with that rather undramatic start, I'm going to grab the slides and share. No, hold on. That's my whole desktop. I don't want to do that. All my secrets. Share screen. Here we are. Okay, so I'm just going to dive through it or spin through it. Again, there's sort of, I'm taking this as a workshop-y approach. So the idea here is to walk through the like very basic ideas of the chapter. So this will be a presentation section. And then in the middle, there's sort of a discussion. I would advocate that we keep recording and sort of talk about it briefly before getting through maybe half an hour of discussion that's sort of facilitated like this, and then opening it up and we can stop recording and have a broader discussion about the book. But that's kind of what I'm hoping for. If you are uncomfortable with that, I think you can let us know in the chat. You can shut off your video, and that would be probably the easiest way. But otherwise, I think it would be pretty boring and pretty short to walk through these 2 chapters without having some discussion about these pieces. That was kind of my schema. So the first chapter here, and it's not like a skill testing question, so don't feel intimidated or anything about the setup there. So this first chapter, Knowledge Architecture Segments, focuses on these 2 questions in my mind. How does an organization or an individual arguably interact with knowledge, and what are the functions that serve those interactions? And Bedford has a really sort of simple way of breaking it up into what she talked about in the last chapter, in chapter 4, as these 3 layers, or she calls them segments, but they really are layers to me. So knowledge availability, knowledge accessibility, and knowledge consumability. So the idea that she gets at here is that every organization needs to render the knowledge that it has available so that it can be accessed, and then from being accessed, it can be consumed, and they kind of stitch together like that. In this chapter, she goes into a lot more detail about all these different pieces, these functional architectures, she calls them. And they are all of these different ways of encouraging, say, availability or accessibility or consumability. And she goes into quite a bit of detail. Although I would call it kind of a vague detail, there's not a lot of real explication about exactly how to do each of these things. It's just sort of, she provides a shape of what it looks like, say, to do knowledge security on a knowledge consumability layer. So again, we're sort of seeing a lot of theory around these ideas, and not necessarily a lot of like, here's what you have to do in a step-by-step fashion, which, I think that's what she's going for in the book. So what I thought I would do with this chapter is walk through these 3 segments and highlight some of the really key takeaways in a very high level form, and then pull out some quotes. And that's the part of discussion that I wanted to have in a couple of minutes. So just to walk through them. So there's knowledge availability, sort of the fundamental layer of the knowledge architecture segments. The idea here is that just because knowledge assets exist, it does not mean they are available to create value wherever value is needed. So if you have a knowledge graph, for instance, that knowledge graph has a bunch of data that is, or information that is available to you, a bunch of knowledge that is available to you, but there's stuff that's in that isn't in that graph that you haven't captured. And so the question is, what knowledge do you need and what knowledge doesn't exist in the knowledge management system that you or your organization is using? And that's the question that this availability layer aims to answer. And so a great example of that is tacit knowledge, this idea that people are hold knowledge in their heads that is very contextual, that depends on their experience and relates to the things that they've done and the things that they are doing. But how available is tacit knowledge to others? Usually it's actually pretty hard unless you're working directly with somebody who knows how to do something. You can't access the tacit knowledge in somebody else's head. And so the question that Bedford asks is, how do we make it more widely available? And you might think, well, let's do an interview with somebody and let's say, ask them questions about what exactly their process is for doing something, say an artist and painting an oil painting. But that actually isn't a great solution, because tacit knowledge as a concept changes continuously. And so the way that the artist approaches one oil painting might change with respect to the next oil painting, and it might change as they evolve. And so that idea, you might be able to take a step-by-step of how to apply a piece of oil to a canvas, but it doesn't necessarily translate to the actual act of painting. And so the challenge is to design mechanisms that allow individuals to explain and share their knowledge. And this is, again, where I'm kind of critical of Bedford's approach to this, because she says that and then she doesn't say, exactly how to do that. She provides a set of what she calls, again, functional architectures, those pieces in those layers that I showed you earlier. But even those don't get that much more pragmatic, I think. And I think it's not her fault. But what she should have said here maybe is that, we don't yet know how to do these kinds of things in a reproducible, systematic way. And that's a neat thing, because that means that there's work to be done, right? So it's not a bad thing. It's just that she kind of walks around it without really being clear about the limitations of what we're capable of in terms of representing these kinds of, and making these kinds of knowledge available. So that's availability. Access is the second layer. We should note here that we're not talking about accessibility in the sort of conventional popular way. We're not talking about how to make sure that, say we have screen readers that can read text to people who can't see the screen and so on. But it relates, I think that topic relates to this. But Bedford's point here is that just because knowledge assets are available does not mean they can be accessed. So you might have that knowledge graph, but what's available in one section, if you're working in one section of a knowledge graph, you might not actually be accessing parts of the knowledge graph that are far, far away. So in the abstract here, I've got a snippet from my own Obsidian graph, which is just like a responsibility to be a good teacher. And there's a bunch of ideas and topics that are connected to that. But then if I'm working somewhere else in that graph, I'm not necessarily accessing what's there, even though teaching might be an important part. And the most obvious example of that right now is that I've got a project as well for helping run this knowledge architecture reading group, right? But those two pieces aren't connected right now. They're not accessing one another. And so there's questions about how to make sure that these different pieces of knowledge can be accessed when you need them. So that's the question. How do we find and discover the knowledge that we've made available? And that the answer to that, or at least the tentative answer that Bedford provides, is finding the entry points and finding ways of providing those entry points. We'll get more into what that looks like in a little bit. The last layer here is consumability. This is the idea that once you've made available and accessible knowledge, how do you use it? How do you consume it? So knowledge is dynamic, and we know that it generates value through use and consumption. Specifically, it diminishes if you don't use it because of a variety of factors, including you lose the context of when it was created, and you lose the experience of how to use it. But the important thing here with this layer is that consumption is always limited, and this is true, although I think I would call it a constraint, not a limitation. Knowledge is always limited, or knowledge consumption is always limited by the boundaries of the last two layers we talked about. So if it's not available and accessible to you, then you can't exactly consume it. That's the real question here. So those are the three layers. And again, in the chapter, she provides a bunch of different functions that contribute to those layers. In the next subsection of this presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the neat takeaways I had from that. But I would just say to anyone listening or watching that if you haven't read the chapter, I would read it like this. I would go through the chapter and sort of pick out the pieces that seem really relevant and interesting to you. I don't know if I would read through it in detail because, for instance, harm and risk management in the knowledge consumability layer had little to do with anything that I need to worry about. But you can sort of use the headings here as a way, as an access point in order to dive in and find the stuff that's useful to you for your own use to apply the ideas in the chapter to the chapter itself. So with that, I just want to jump into a few of the takeaways and ask the group, what you thought about it. So just diving here into some of the pieces of or functional architectures that I thought were most interesting, and in particular the quotes or concepts that she provided that were really neat, I thought. So one of those is the idea of designing for preservation and conservation. And this is in Making Knowledge. I think it's one of the availability pieces, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So in making sure that knowledge is available, one of the functions of that is preservation and conservation. And she said that the challenges we face here are maintaining the focus on assets over packaging, acting for the long term, and then making sure that we're focused on availability and access rather than lockdown and storage. And so this last point was really kind of interesting to me because I guess I would have assumed that those things are the same, but arguably they're not. And that's the idea she's putting forward. So I wanted to ask her, like, did you also see that similarity or distinction, or, does it make sense to you?
So
your microphone. Yeah, Lee, go.
So actually her distinction made sense to me. She has a picture somewhere of a cutaway of an onion, and she points,
it's coming up.
Yeah, she points to, but it's relevant to what she's saying here. It points to the kernel of knowledge of the asset. And so what she's, in this section, what I think she's trying to get us to do is look at the content, such a loaded word, but the knowledge itself somehow, instead of how it's packaged, because we tend to think of, in information management terms, the lockdown and storage and physical accessibility and packaging, as she's calling it here, are deeply tied to the piece of knowledge. And so I think challenges is a good word, because there's still the whole preservability across media problem at the physical layer below this. But she's trying to raise this up a level to being able to look at knowledge content regardless of format and packaging. And that's a tricky thing. It seems to me, I mean, the tacit knowledge thing you just did is a key example of that, right? How do you capture in a physical or digital medium the fact that Joe knows something about this? Because in an organization, you know that you go call Joe for this and you call Susie for that because they're the experts on it. So yeah, this rather resonated with me.
Yeah, Brian?
Yeah, this whole chapter, from applying my work experience to it, a lot of this seems like it's just really heavy on either references or just discussion around the structure of like SQL databases, which are incredibly common in business environments. And the section about searching for knowledge assets like really was the one that stuck out to me the most. Not for any particular reason, just because it seems like that was the one that was like the most poignant, that we deal with the most, is like we talked about in the last meeting, of just the constant feed of an inundation of information. That the biggest toolboxes we need right now are the ability to cut through the noise and filter, but then also now that we have this giant pool of filtered content, inputs, outputs, information, we need to be able to search through it and easily navigate and look through it. But then also on page 87, a little bit of the knowledge asset authentication and provenance tracking. big words basically, but for what I really got out of that was the last little couple sentences, and some interesting point is basically, how do you pin down originality of a piece of content? How do you identify the copies, any falsifications? And something interesting that's been like in the forefront of my mind was NFTs, and applying NFTs to that sort of context was a really interesting little paradigm I've been chewing on lately of how do you identify a digital asset as the original and track it through iterations and how as it moves through digital space. And then I'm not sure this is in this chapter or not. That's in the next chapter. So yeah.
Yeah, you both raise great points. Lee, one thing that you said reminded me of, I keep thinking about food metaphors here with this stuff, so I'm going to go back there. But I remember reading an article on Atlas Obscura, and I'll provide notes. I'll provide a link to it in the notes, where somebody found a recipe for a meal made in a pub in Pompeii. So there's like if you've heard the story of, if you haven't heard the story of Pompeii, it was covered by ashes in a volcano. It's extremely well preserved. So there's a pub there, and if you could figure out how to read, I think it was images. I don't think it was even a text-based menu. You could figure out what the recipes were, and then work back from there to figure out how they were preparing food in ancient Italy. And it's really interesting because the food is unique and different, but it had been lost, not only because it got buried in a volcano, but it took so many thousands of years for somebody to figure out how to strip away that packaging and reorganize it in order to be able to figure out what the food was like again, and then make it. Some of these exercises are really kind of wild because people will go all out and try to build the same kind of kilns and stuff that you'd use in a pub in ancient history. So they can be really committed, but the point still stands that there's this old way of preparing food that might actually be quite different from what we're doing now, but it was lost because of the way the knowledge asset itself was preserved. So that's like a really sort of concrete example, but I also find it's kind of shallow. And maybe I'm just not keeping in mind the Library of Alexandria enough or whatever. But it feels like in the modern world, with all of the tech and tools we have available, that this kind of loss shouldn't be possible anymore. We shouldn't see a library burn down and lose all this content, but I don't know, maybe I'm being too idealistic.
I was on a listserv for a while of audio preservationists. And so substantial numbers of posts were devoted to, I have a 3M acetate XYZ tape of so-and-so that's become adhered. Do I heat it or chill it? And it's an arcane and far more detailed kind of thing than that. And yet we're talking about artifacts far younger, less than a century old. And there's still issues of preservation because there are only a few of a master tape or something. So her waterfall chart of different periods seems really relevant because I love the Pompeii menu example, right? It's like, okay, so stone tablet's not such a bad packaging method.
That's a good point. The medium did last in spite of a volcanic eruption. But I wonder though, so even though those are more recent examples, they're still they're physical, right? So does encoding things in bits and bytes help avoid that? Do you think we're going to have less and less of those kinds of listservs in the future?
Or not if you get a degaussed hard drive.
Yeah, fair.
But even without that, just formats.
Yeah.
Right?
File formats, yeah.
Yeah, file formats have the same problem.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all kinds of information rot, even with digital stuff.
That's true. And then there was the recent investigation. Team of researchers at Harvard, I think, worked with New York Times to figure out what its state of link rot was. And a substantial number of links to different parts of the web over the course of years had fallen fallen apart. So half, I don't know, I don't want to be extreme, but a significant percentage of the links from like 10 years ago that the New York Times had linked to are dead and no longer usable. So yeah, I guess I'm wrong. This is a key problem even on a 10-year scale.
Yeah, and I was thinking, just from the scale of like digital archiving, like it's like also new, like digital preservation is like a new field too, and like sure, like things like plain text and PDF and a couple of formats are pretty stable. Like there's no official archival quality sound format. Like we're coming to agree that MP3, MP4 is probably one of the official, but I mean, FLAC is also an option that's completely lost as audio. But for like doing digital preservation, we still have no idea how to preserve video over the long term. Like how do we preserve it against loss? Like a lot of things people don't know is like you can't use a solid state drive in an archive, for example, because solid state drives will just lose data to the air because they're electrical currents. So it's like data will just disappear off a solid state drive. So you have to use a hard drive, like one of the old school hard drives with the disk in them. But how long do those last? Like we have, sure, I have just last year I was holding a tablet that we had from Sumeria that still had the data on it. We could still read it. But when things get burned, like the library in South Africa, the National Library burned, the university library burned down, and like entire records and like things that were just lost forever now because they not only is it not backed up, or it wasn't backed up well, and it wasn't necessarily thought through behind, but like it's also like not their fault because it's just lost. Like it's on fire, and it's like they don't have the resources to do like Western level archiving where you have copies of everything stored in multiple places around the world. So yeah, it's really interesting. And just thinking from trying to connect this to this chapter, like for me, here she's setting up like what this is the rest of the book, and that's the chapter is very listy, right? But I found the layer on accessibility was probably the part that draws me the most interest in this book. It's just like, how do we get to it? How do we make sure it's described in a way that people can find it? So yeah, I do think I'm glad to see like things are getting a little bit more specific. I do think it does happen a little bit more in the next chapter.
So I'm going to use that as a segue because that was the next piece that I also found interesting out of the accessibility layer. This seeking and discovering functional architecture. A few of these pieces that she recommends in terms of understanding knowledge-seeking practices and behaviors or patterns were like they're words for things that I didn't have before. This idea that you have different discovery methods for knowledge, picking, browsing, grazing, and satisficing, and then this idea that there's a difference between seeking and findability. Both of those things kind of made me pause because I definitely have done all of these different behaviors, and it's really neat to think about when one of them might be more desirable than the other and trying to be more intentional about that. So again, I wonder, did anybody else kind of pick up on the same ideas, or like, have you had experience with these things formally before? What are your thoughts? Maybe I'll just say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the thoughts with like the different methods that she mentions here. Maybe it would help. But I'm recognizing berry picking, browsing, grazing, but maybe it would help us to define some of these terms.
I don't know what the definitions of them. I can imagine what they are, but if you have them, feel free.
Yeah. So the discovery methods she's talking about here are like concepts in LIS, like berry picking is like this very old one where it's just like this idea of a user that goes into the library and they're looking for, let's say, research on coffee seems to be a metaphor. So they go into research on coffee and they're going to pick various sources that look good from the index and be like, okay, I need a source on how to get to how coffee beans grown and so on. And then browsing kind of that. I think we're all familiar with browsing to a file interface now. Grazing is where you like kind of like look over like a terms of a content of a book and I would graze over and be like, is this useful to me? And maybe not. I don't know what satisficing is, to be honest. And then seeking findability, you already talked about.
I actually know the definition of satisficing.
Oh, tell me.
It was in a management book in something I did in when I was at Geico in the 80s. It was the idea of, it's a combination of satisfying and sufficient. And so it's really trying to encapsulate the better to get it done than perfect. It's enough for the purpose.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Brian, I saw your hand.
I just found the usage of index to connote a little bit less of like a library index of this section to find that book, and more of just a sheer volume with, again, databases. A lot of this just connotes database to me, and a lot of the management of that. So index is like on a table to easily sort your values for insert, reading, and deletion.
Yeah, the stuff on indexing I've also found interesting because it reminded me of all of the talk of different ways people create manual indexes in the modern linked thinking apps, Roman, Obsidian, and the like, because it's necessary more and more that we are creating these weird sort of qualitative databases of our own thinking by creating these different indexes that give us a view over our thoughts in a specific sort of context. So there's this weird sort of modern behavior on indexing that I don't think we've seen before, thanks to Obsidian and these other different apps that are causing us to try and find better ways of organizing content. Yeah, Lee.
So I think of what you just described as kind of curated indexing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in a position where I work with a lot of unstructured data as well, and full text search. And I think indexing is going to have to become much smarter and more automated. There's already some of this. So if you're in the Microsoft Office products and you want to insert an image, there's actually a very good search engine where they've tagged the photos. I'm pretty sure they've used image processing to generate the tags, not that somebody went through and sat there and clicked on boat for all the boat pictures. But I think that concept writ large is a requirement of where she's positioning indexing as a means of retrieval. And that goes even further when you get into physical objects and metadata level access to things that you can't really fully digitize, or that it's not practical to have in, quote, the object.
Right. There's also an important tension here with consumability, I think, because what it boils down to is, especially this particular functional architecture that we're looking at right now, seeking and discovering, is cognitive capacity. There's the classic idea that we only have the ability to hold 5 different sort of objects in our head at once. And that's really what Bedford's getting at here, is that in the next chapter, with object modeling, is that we can only hold 5 kind of things in our head at once, plus or minus 2. And so when we think about the balance between seeking and findability, it's because, if you go searching for something and then you see 3 or 4 different items that are slightly related but different from what you're searching for, then all of a sudden your brain gets a little muddled with that, and you might actually lose the train of thought or go in a different direction because of that. And that might be a good thing or a bad thing, but that's the tension we're really wrestling with, is like, how do you optimize seeking and how do you optimize finding so that you can make the most of it, so that you can deal with that consumption level. And that's really the tension we're having here. For the sake of speed, or time rather, I'm going to move on a little bit, but we can keep talking about this later. So we talked a bit about index structures already. One thing I wanted to highlight on this functional architecture, where we're specifically talking about search, is this idea of search logging and feedback capabilities. This kind of blew my mind more than anything else in this chapter. The idea that if you're searching for something in your own work, do you actually keep a track of how successful you were, and then use that information to re-engineer whatever you're searching through, or whatever your search approach is. I certainly don't. My approach to search is definitely one of satisficing, and it's just a novel idea to me that we should kind of have this second level of loop of learning on our approach to searching our own stuff. So that's what I took away from that. I'll pause. Anybody else have any thoughts or ideas?
Is this relating more to like the actual logging? Like your actions are logged, and so you're looking at that as some additional aspect?
I took it as, because of the word feedback in there, it's like literally, do you have a double loop learning around like, okay, so you tried to search for something and you were not quite as successful as you wanted. You knew that you had something in your head or something in your database, say, that you wanted to find. You tried to search for it, you didn't quite find it. How successful was that? And why was it successful or not successful? And then can you use the information about why it was successful or not successful to potentially change the way you search later, or go back and the next time you look at that piece of data you were looking for, add keywords to it, say, so that it is more findable or searchable later on. So that's what I took from it, is like logging is the idea of actually saying like, okay, here are the searches that I did in this particular project. How successful were they? And what kind of feedback can I take from them in order to have a better system next time?
I got 2 points from that. The first one, this just sounds like an iterative improvement to your system, which I thought is just what we all do. Yeah, what if you find something that doesn't work and you need to add a piece of metadata to a particular class of documents you had difficulty finding, then you've just iteratively improved your system because you've added a component that didn't exist, and now that search is no longer going to be a problem. It's kind of also just like the agile MVP method. Identify an issue, it's small, fix it, see how it changes, continue to move forward. But the idea of logging, again, database stuff. You do an action, it triggers a logging event, it insert record into table, which just says who did what, did when, etc. That is also like a very useful aspect of like, because if we're doing like 100 actions at the actual action layer, and there's just like this watchful observer watching you do actions, and it could just say on this day this person ran this did this action 100 times, then that level of abstraction that's also automated is able to give you insight into what you're doing, and that's just another piece of information that you can use to, I don't know, for any purpose, but at another layer of abstraction.
I think also just like in a literal sense, like libraries often have, they'll like on a, sometimes depending on the library, but sometimes often on an abstract level, they'll like see like somebody searching for multiple things, and then try to see like, okay, are they getting successful? And sometimes that's like sitting down with patrons and being like, okay, find something on why, show us how you do it, just talk it out. And like that's really helpful for help developing like library systems be better. But I was saying the thing that I was pulling your mind, Ryan, was like the idea of like logging what we did for the searches. If you're doing that, like when you're like searching for something in the literature, that's really helpful for like just pre-writing your literature, like a comprehensive literature review. So like for a paper I did or presenting on, I basically read, I went through like thousands of papers and got about 500 papers. And so like just modeling exactly when I searched each time in which database helps a lot to be like, okay, I don't need to go back and like double search this third database the fourth time.
Yeah, for sure. These kinds of things are definitely the things that I've done when I've been systematic about a project, like a systematic literature review, but never when I'm like, just looking for that file I used last week on my computer. And that's the distinction, is like, how do we apply this in practice in the mundane? So anyway, for now, I think I will skip this last one and jump on to chapter 6 just to present on it, and then I think we can cut the recording and talk more freely. Stop letting me control it with facilitation. So chapter 6 was knowledge object modeling. The idea here is to task the knowledge architect with thinking about the models of knowledge assets that are being made available, accessible, and consumable. So that center of the onion that we heard about a little while ago. And so these are really the main two things I took away from this chapter. I found it quite a technical walkthrough of like conceptual modeling of ontology. And even though my PhD is effectively in conceptual modeling, I hate it. So I did not like dive into this too much. I don't want to draw a bunch of UML diagrams about the different pieces of knowledge that I have in my work, say. But I do think it's important and potentially valuable to consider it at least in the abstract. And so the idea here that Bedford's getting at is that that on the left, this idea that you have different classes of knowledge assets contained in anything that you do. And you can actually use those classes to help provide for all of the functions we just talked about. Specifically, so let's say you are talking about that search feedback loop that we were just discussing. You search for something, say it's a recipe, just to keep using that food metaphor, and you fail to find it, maybe because you didn't have for some reason, the ingredients clearly labeled as an attribute in that recipe. Then this idea of object modeling gives you the ability to say, well, what are the attributes of the object class of recipes? What are the most important things that I should have there? How do you specify what those things are? What kinds of behaviors might you add to them? And so to keep going with that metaphor, you might have a recipe and you might actually acknowledge that the ingredients can be scaled. So if anybody's used the app Paprika, the Paprika has a really neat feature where if you're going to double the size of a recipe, you can just you can scale it, and then it recognizes that all these ingredients can be multiplied and tells you how many grams of whatever spice to put in. So you can give these different attributes of the class of recipes different behaviors, and that can lead to usability, that can enhance consumption and access. And similarly, you might have relationships between these different parts of your classes. So for instance, recipes could have different sub-recipes in it. You know, maybe you want to make a cilantro and a cilantro speckled rice. And so that's part of another meal that you're putting together. So you've got the recipe for one thing, but that actually is including recipes for another thing as a part whole relationship. Similarly, maybe you are writing a recipe book and you want to add versioning to be able to say, you know, these are iterations. Maybe version 1 was better than version 6. Although I've never seen anybody like use Git for recipe management and branching or forking different recipes. I'd love to see a coder chef somewhere work that kind of model. But all of this to say, you know, there is some value in considering the kinds of knowledge, the classes of knowledge you're working with, and how the parts or attributes or relationships those classes have can help you use them and make them accessible and make them more available. Similarly, this object or graphic story on the right shows this idea that there is an asset at the center, but it's really important to recognize what the asset is and separate that from all of the different parts that we add to knowledge assets in order to store them. And so we might have a recipe, but if that recipe is contained in a PDF that is not even OCR'd, you know, doesn't even have searchable text, then there's a big difference between storing a recipe in a photo of handwritten text that's converted to a PDF that isn't OCR'd from storing it in a like literal recipe class object in an app like Paprika. And that's really what this right-hand idea is getting at. I don't think that necessarily means that, and this is an important tension, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's always best to translate everything to, you know, that kind of itemized class of specified attributes. In other words, you know, you might not want to take every recipe you ever have and put it in Paprika, because the reason you might be storing that recipe might not be because you want to make it again. Maybe it's a scan or a photo of your grandmother's recipe book. And what you're actually contained in that knowledge asset is the memories or the handwriting or, you know, I don't know, the little hearts your grandmother put over the I in cookie or whatever. So there's the question is, what is the asset in these different debates? Or these different discussions. So these are the two kind of key figures that I took away from this chapter. And then the last, Bedford goes through a wide variety of types of classes that you might want to consider. I think it's a useful reference. I wouldn't necessarily go through it in detail unless you have a particular reason to do so. I again would use it as a reference and say I want to do this kind of object modeling, and then look at what she's got written down for some instruction. But what was neat was the end of the chapter contained this exercise that she kind of wrote down and then left. And I won't do it for the sake of time, but I was going to take us through this as a workshop, where the idea is to actually look at the kinds of knowledge that you use and contain in your and keep in your personal life, and then deconstruct it and build out these object models and see how they're useful. And so I'll just walk through the steps really briefly. The idea would be to choose several knowledge assets. So like pick out a couple of different things that maybe you used today or yesterday, and then deconstruct them in order to figure out what is the actual asset at the center, the kernel of that asset. Ask yourself, what class of object is this? What are the kinds of attributes or specifications or behaviors that these assets might have? How do they relate to others? And then, find a couple of other examples of what you think that might be and see if it fits. And by doing this, you might find some insights in enhancing the availability, access, and consumability of your knowledge in your own personal stuff. So with that, I think I'll pause. We can hit stop recording and chat it out.